Lyra's arms tightened around the sleeping infant as Kale's voice cut through the stone chamber like a blade forged in ice. She had known this moment would come. Some part of her had always known, but no amount of dread could prepare her for the actual weight of those words. Take the child. Now. The guards shifted forward from their posts. She could smell the leather of their armor, the starch of the formal military dress that marked them as Kale's personal enforcers, not soldiers of common rank. This was not a standard order filtered through channels. This was the Alpha speaking directly to those sworn to his blood. You will not touch him, Lyra said. Her voice was steady, which surprised her. She had expected to break, to plead, to become someone she no longer recognized. Instead, she found herself standing beside the window of the northern tower, the child's small weight against her chest, solid as truth, her body a barrier that would hold. Kale stood with his back to her, his shoulders bearing the weight of the fur-lined ceremonial cloak that denoted his station. Outside, snow fell in thick sheets across the Packlands, muffling the world. They were alone but for the guards, and that was exactly as he had arranged it. No witnesses but those bound to absolute silence. Your defiance ends now, he said, and when he turned, she saw what months of absence had carved into his face. The line of his jaw was harder. The silver threading through his dark hair had deepened. His eyes, the pale amber that had once softened only for her, were now fixed on some distant calculation that did not include her in its architecture. She is waiting, he continued, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. The guards remained motionless, statues in leather and steel. The consort is waiting to receive you at court. You understand what that means? Your position here is untenable. We agreed on this. We agreed to nothing, Lyra said, and now a tremor did enter her voice, though she kept it controlled, sharpened. You announced a decision and left me to interpret silence as consent. She had watched for 6 months as he retreated into the formalities of his rank. There had been visits, yes, hurried nights when he would come to her small chamber in the eastern wing, when he would hold their son with a tenderness that contradicted everything his public self had become. Those visits had grown shorter. The space between them had filled with protocol, with the weight of what a pack demanded from its alpha, with the careful appearance of a man unentangled. The consort was a wolf from the northern territories, a marriage of political alliance designed to cement Kale's authority. Lyra had always known she was borrowed time, a luxury an alpha could not afford to want. What she had not known was how completely he would dismantle what they had built in the spaces between secrecy. The child cannot stay, Kale said. His jaw worked as he spoke, and she saw the effort it took him to maintain that tone level, authoritative, devoid of the pull that had always drawn her across any distance. Pack law is explicit. A bastard child undermines my authority with the consort. It creates complications. He is your son, Lyra said. That is not a complication. That is a truth. He is a liability, Kale corrected, and something in her chest caved inward at the clinical precision of the word. She had known him capable of ruthlessness. She had been attracted to it. Once, to the way power moved through him with such certainty. Now that ruthlessness was directed at the small life she had carried and birthed and loved in the silence of knowing he was never hers to keep. The infant stirred against her chest, a small sound of discontent. Lyra shifted him automatically, the movement as natural as breathing. Even through the fabric of her dark dress, she could feel the solid reality of him, the warm weight of him, the physical proof that he existed. Where? She asked. The word came out hollow. The abbey at Whiteglass. The sisters take in children of noble origins. He will be raised well, educated, prepared for what? Lyra cut in. For a life where he never knows his father? For the knowledge that he was disposed of like… She stopped herself, knowing that further words would only feed his certainty that this was the right course, that her resistance was the desperate clinging of a woman unable to accept her station. Perhaps that was all it was. Perhaps she had never been anything more than a passing desire, a breach in protocol that Kale was now righteously correcting. The door to the chamber opened. Lyra's sister entered first, her face deliberately neutral, the expression she wore when she had been recruited to perform an unpleasant task. Behind her came the woman Lyra had dreaded and expected in equal measure. The consort, early, already moving through the tower like she had always belonged there. The chamber's beautiful, the consort said to Cale, her voice pitched to exclude Lyra entirely, which was its own kind of violence. She wore white fur that seemed to drink in the winter light, and when she turned her head, her eyes darker than Cale's, sharper found the child. "Is this, the adoption is being arranged?" Cale said, and Lyra heard the fiction settle into place, becoming official. Once it was spoken aloud, it would calcify. Servants would repeat it, the pack would accept it. The story would become truth through sheer repetition and social pressure. Good. The consort smiled, and it was a smile that acknowledged no competition because it perceived none. "I prefer to begin our reign cleanly." Lyra's sister stepped forward. She was still young enough to be uncertain how to hold this moment, her face betraying the conflict she had been instructed not to feel. "Lyra, we should prepare the child for travel. The sisters expect." "No," Lyra said. She did not shout. She did not allow her voice to fracture. She simply said it, a statement of absolute refusal that made the guard shift. That made Cale's nostrils flare slightly, the physical tell of a wolf recognizing a challenge. "He is not traveling anywhere tonight, not today, not until he has been examined by a physician, and the child will be ready to depart within the hour," Cale interrupted. The Alpha was speaking now, not the man she had known in darkness, the Alpha whose will was law within these walls. "His nursemaid will accompany him to ensure the transition is—" "I am his mother," Lyra said. And the words seemed to crack something open in the room, some acknowledgement of blood, and claim that even the formality of protocol could not entirely suppress. "I will accompany him." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to pause at the windows. Cale's expression did not change, but she saw the calculation shift behind those pale eyes. The consort's hand moved to his arm in a gesture of proprietorial reassurance. Her sister made a small sound, half warning, half disbelief. "That is not possible," Cale said finally. "Your role here, my role is finished," Lyra said, and the clarity of it struck her even as she spoke. All along she had been waiting for him to make a choice that would absolve her of having to make one. She had been waiting for a moment that would grant her permission to leave. "I will go with my son to Whiteglass. I will ensure he is settled. And then I will determine my own path forward." She looked directly at Cale as she said it, and for a fraction of a second, something flickered across his face. A recognition, perhaps, of what was being severed. The consort felt it too. Her fingers tightened on his arm. "Absolutely not," the consort said, her voice losing its pleasant tone. "The Alpha's former is a free woman within Packlands," Lyra finished. She had moved to the door before she fully decided to move, the child still secure against her chest. Her sister watched her pass, uncertainty and something like hope warring in her expression. "I invoke the right of safe passage to the border. That is law, even for Alphas." She did not wait for his response. She could not afford to see what answer might be written in his face, what negotiation or rage or regret might tempt her backward. She carried her son down the corridor that had been her world for 2 years, past the tapestries and the torches, past the guards who knew better than to interfere with a direct challenge to the Alpha's authority. Behind her she heard Cale's voice, low and urgent, speaking to the consort. She did not catch the words, but she caught the tone, something between apology and explanation, the voice of a man already rewriting the story of what had just occurred. The child woke in her arms as she reached the eastern stairs, his small face emerging from the blanket, his eyes unfocused and confused. He made a sound, not quite a word, but the precursor to one. In another month, if given the chance, he might have spoken his first true word. But the consort would not give him that month. The Abbey would give him education and discipline and a careful forgetting of the tower where he was born. Lyra descended into the darkness, carrying what she could not save toward the only choice that remained. The village of Croston sat at the intersection of 3 roads, and Lyra chose it because it was neutral ground, far enough from the tower that word of her departure had not yet arrived, close enough that she could reach it before nightfall. The inn was dim and warm, dense with the smell of roasted meat and spiced wine. She had taken a room under an assumed name and paid extra for discretion, a practice that required no explanation in places like this, where women travelled alone for reasons best left unspoken. The child slept in the wooden crib she had arranged to have brought up, his small chest rising and falling with the regular rhythm of deep sleep. Lyra sat by the window, a cup of tea cooling in her hands, and watched the snow fall across the courtyard below. She had perhaps 2 days before Cale sent riders after her. Not to retrieve her, he would not waste that effort, but to ensure she understood the terms of her exile. The words unspoken but clear: do not return, do not speak of what transpired, do not create complications. The knock on her door came as she was changing the child's linens. She froze, her hands stilling, her body recognizing danger before her mind could articulate it. The knock came again, softer. The innkeeper sends word, a woman's voice called through the wood. There's a guest below asking after a woman traveling with a child. I thought you should know before they asked me directly. Lyra opened the door to find a serving woman, perhaps 40, with the weathered face of someone who had seen enough to recognize trouble when it wore a noble's insignia. Who? Lyra asked. Did not give a name. But he's got the look of the tower about him. Soldier's bearing. He's asking the owner casual-like, but you can tell he's not asking casual at all. Liera's mind moved swiftly through possibilities, each one narrower than the last. A tracker sent by Chaol, an official of the pack coming to retrieve the child on legal grounds. Or something worse, the consort, acting preemptively to ensure Lyra understood the hierarchy of her removal. Thank you, Lyra said, and she pressed coins into the woman's hand. Which road leads fastest to the Northern Territories? The serving woman glanced back down the corridor, then leaned closer. You're not one of his, are you? The Alphas? It was not a question. Lyra saw the calculation in the woman's eyes, the assessment of whether she should help or hand her over. In small villages like this, the Alpha's word was law, but so was the code of women who recognized their own kind in trouble. I am no one's, Lyra said, and something in those words must have satisfied whatever test the woman was running. The road that runs north from the eastern edge of the village. It splits toward the Abbey lands after about 5 miles. You'll see a stone cross. Turn where the cross points, but you'll want to move quick. That man downstairs, he's the patient type. The dangerous kind. Lyra packed with an efficiency born of necessity. 2 dresses, linen, the child's things, a purse of coin that would last perhaps a month if she was careful. She wrapped the boy in extra blankets and waited until the common room had grown loud with evening drinking before slipping down the service stairs and into the cold. The horse she had hired was patient and steady, built for snow rather than speed. She moved through the village's edge slowly enough not to draw attention, then faster once the buildings fell away, and there was only the white landscape and the sound of hoofbeats muffled by accumulation. Behind her, she could imagine the man in the inn, still asking his casual questions, not yet understanding that his quarry had already bolted. The child woke somewhere in the darkness between villagers, crying with the particular urgency of an infant who needed to be fed and changed. Lyra pulled the horse to a stop beneath a stand of dense pines, and managed the necessities as best she could with numb fingers, speaking to him in a low voice, not the formal language of the tower, but something older, something that belonged only to them. I know, she whispered. I know. This is not what you wanted. This is not what either of us wanted. But we move forward now. This is the only direction left. The child could not understand her words, but he understood the steady tone, the hands that held him with certainty rather than the trembling anxiety that lived underneath. He settled back into sleep with the resilience of the young, and Lyra continued north. She reached the stone cross as the sky was beginning to lighten from complete black to something approximating grey. The road split as promised, and she took the path that led deeper into the forest, toward the lands that belonged to the Sisters of Whiteglass. The abbey emerged from the mist like a structure from another world, pale stone that seemed to glow, towers with narrow windows, a garden surrounded by a high wall. In summer, she had been told, the wall was covered in climbing roses and morning glories. Now it was just stone and frost and the absolute separation it promised. She was halfway through the gates when she heard the horses behind her. There were 3 of them, moving with the coordinated precision of trained riders. Lyra's breath caught, and she urged her own mount forward, toward the abbey entrance where she could see movement figures in dark robes, the shape of actual sanctuary, if she could only reach it. The lead rider caught up with her just as her horse reached the courtyard. He was not a soldier, she realized with a shock that left her momentarily paralyzed. It was Chaol's brother, Sorin, the man who had stood beside them at a dozen secret meetings, who had covered for Chaol's absences, who wore his loyalty like a second skin. Lyra. Stop, he called, and there was no threat in his voice. which was somehow worse than if there had been. She turned the horse, her body already preparing for flight, but Soren raised his hands in a gesture of surrender. Behind him, the two riders remained mounted at a respectful distance, but they were positioned to prevent any sudden departure. "I am not here to retrieve the child," Soren said, dismounting with the fluid grace of a man who moved through the world with absolute confidence. "Chaol sent me to—" He stopped, seeming to recalibrate whatever explanation he had prepared. "He sent me to ensure you reached here safely, and to tell you something you need to know before you hand him over." Lyra did not dismount. The height of the horse gave her a small advantage, a psychological elevation that felt critical. "I have nothing left to hear from Chaol." "This is not from Chaol," Soren said, and now she saw the conflict moving through his face like a storm across water. "This is from me, because I should have told him years ago, and because I will not watch another child become a pawn in a game he did not create." One of the sisters had emerged from the abbey, drawn by the commotion. She was old, with eyes that had seen enough suffering to make her immune to most forms of drama. She watched the scene unfold with the patience of someone accustomed to crises. "What?" Lyra demanded. "Say it. Chaol cannot father a child," Soren said, and the words fell into the courtyard like stones into still water. "He has been infertile since the wolf fever 3 years ago. The consort does not know this. The pack does not know this. If it becomes known, his authority will shatter. A wolf alpha who cannot breed is—" "No," Lyra said, and the denial came from somewhere deep, from a place that had already begun to accept a different version of this story. "That is not. The child is his." "The child is not his," Soren said with the terrible gentleness of someone delivering a truth he has rehearsed many times. "I do not know whose child he is. Perhaps you do not know either. But Chaol knew. He has known since you told him you were pregnant. And he chose to claim the boy anyway, until the consort arrived and the political calculations shifted." The world tilted slightly. Lyra gripped the pommel of the saddle, conscious of the sister watching from the abbey entrance, conscious of the snow falling in large, heavy flakes that seemed to be the only movement in the universe. "Why would he tell you this?" "Because he needed someone to know," Soren said. "Because he does not trust himself to do the right thing, and he was hoping someone else would make the choice for him. Because he loves you, and he was terrified of what that love might cost if he acknowledged it." Lyra looked down at the child, sleeping in the blankets in front of her. The small face was peaceful, unmarked by any of this. What Soren was telling her was that the boy had been a fictional, along that Chaol's acceptance had been built on a foundation that could not hold, that the moment the consort arrived was the moment the carefully constructed compromise collapsed. But none of that changed the essential fact. The child was still hers. The love was still real, even if the father was not. "Why are you telling me this?" Lyra asked. "Because you need to understand what you are walking away from," Soren said. "Not a man who rejected his bastard. A man who was rejecting his own nature, his own desire to claim what was not his by law. And because he wanted you to have a choice, even if he was too much a coward to give you one directly." Lyra turned back toward the abbey, where the sister was beginning to retreat, understanding that she was witnessing something private. "I've already made my choice," she said. "I chose my son. The rest of it, Calais, the tower, the consort, the pack, none of that matters anymore." She heard Soren move behind her, heard the soft sound of hoofbeats as he remounted. "Chaol asked me to give you this," he called, and she turned to see him holding something, a small object wrapped in cloth, the size of a fist. She did not reach for it immediately. She already knew what it would be, something precious, something meant to be a bridge across the distance she was creating, something that would make the next years harder. Knowing that someone had been thinking of her, mourning her, wishing he had been brave enough to choose differently. "Leave it at the gate," she said, her voice steady even as something inside her fractured. "I cannot take it with me." But she would go back for it later, once the child was safe in the abbey's care. She would hold it and weep the tears she could not afford to shed now. That was the gift and the curse of this moment, the knowledge that what was ending was not a betrayal, but a tragedy, and that sometimes the only way forward was through the unbearable acknowledgement that love was not enough. The Mother Superior was not cruel, but she was practical in a way that left no room for sentiment. Her name was Catherine, and she had been running the abbey for 30 years, which meant she had seen every variety of desperation a woman could bring through her gates. She listened to Lyra's story without interruption, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes tracking something beyond the immediate moment. The child would be well cared for, Mother Catherine said, and it was not a promise so much as a statement of fact. We have protocols. He will be raised here among the foundlings and wards, educated, given a trade if he shows aptitude, sent out into the world when he comes of age. It is a decent life. What do I owe you? Lyra asked. She had expected this negotiation, had already calculated how much she could afford to pay. Nothing, for the boy, Mother Catherine said. She turned her pale grey eyes fully on Lyra for the first time. But you cannot stay here indefinitely. The Abbey is not a refuge for women running from powerful men. It is a sanctuary for children and sisters devoted to prayer. You understand? Lyra nodded. She had always known this would be temporary. A way station between one impossible situation and another. I can work, Lyra said. I can teach the children, or you are too young and too beautiful to take vows, Mother Catherine interrupted gently. And a woman without status wearing our robes would only complicate things. No. You will have 3 days to spend with the child while we complete the intake procedures. Then you will need to decide your next destination. The 3 days passed in a haze of small, devastating intimacies. Lyra fed him in the Abbey's kitchen, which smelled of bread and herbs. She changed him in a small room they provided, learning the rhythm of his body, the particular way he quieted when she hummed. The other sisters treated her with polite distance, the kind of courtesy extended to visiting family members who would soon be gone. They did not ask questions. They had learned long ago not to. On the second day, she watched him sleep in the small crib they had prepared, and she allowed herself to imagine a version of events where she had simply left him in the tower. What would Cale have done with an infant while he took a bride? What would the consort have done? Perhaps the same thing brought him to Whiteglass, severed the connection, moved forward into a life that was cleaner and less complicated. Perhaps she had only delayed the inevitable. The women came on the third evening. There were 6 of them, ranging from girls barely older than Lyra to a woman in her 60s whose bearing suggested former nobility. They arrived by cart from the village, and Mother Catherine explained they were being provided shelter for the winter refugees from various circumstances, each with her own story the Abbey tactfully did not inquire into. One of them would be staying permanently and helping with the children. The others were looking for passage to other territories come spring. Dinner was a formal affair in the Abbey's dining hall, long wooden tables and candles that cast flickering shadows across the stone walls. Lyra had intended to eat alone in her room, but Mother Catherine had other ideas. You should meet them, the superior said with a firmness that brooked no argument. You are not the only woman here making difficult choices. The woman across from Lyra was dark-skinned, with elaborate scarification patterns along her temples that marked her as foreign. She introduced herself as Amara, from the southern kingdoms, though she offered no explanation for her presence at a northern abbey. To her right sat a girl of perhaps 16, with the fragile look of someone recently recovered from trauma. To Lyra's left was an older woman with sharp eyes and calloused hands, a healer, it turned out, who had been traveling between territories offering her services. You have the look of a woman in transition, the healer said, which was an observation so precise it felt almost violent. Running towards something, or away from something? Both, Lyra said, and something about the directness of the question loosened her tongue. Neither. I am not certain anymore. That is the best state to be in, Amara said, her accent making the words sound like a prophecy. Certainty is what traps us. My husband was certain. He was so certain of who I was, what I should do, how I should move through the world. I am here because I finally became uncertain of his certainty. The girl beside her listened with the intensity of someone learning new languages for survival. She did not speak, but her eyes tracked every word. The man you left behind, the healer continued, he is certain. That is why you are here, because his certainty did not have room for you in it. Lyra set down her spoon with deliberate care. She had not mentioned Cale, had not indicated there was a man at all. The healer simply watched her with the patience of someone who had extracted confessions from the dying. He made a choice, Lyra said carefully. He made a choice for you, Amara corrected. That is different. A man making a choice for himself, for his legacy, for his position, that I understand. But a man deciding what another person should want, what another person should accept, that is a special kind of cruelty. The other women at the table had grown quiet, understanding that something essential was being articulated. Even the young girl had stopped eating, her attention entirely on the conversation. "What did you do?" Lyra asked Amara. "After you left." "I ran," Amara said simply. "I ran for 2 years. I worked in kitchens, in laundries, in markets. I moved from city to city, always moving, because staying meant thinking, and thinking meant missing him. And missing him meant considering going back. And then in a small town near the coast, I stopped running. I bought a house. I started a garden. I became someone who was not defined by his absence. The silence that followed was dense with possibility." Lyra realized, with a strange clarity, that this woman across the table was showing her a version of her own future. Not a map exactly, but evidence that such a future existed. "Do you miss him?" the young girl asked suddenly, her voice small and uncertain. "Every day," Amara said. "But missing someone and needing to be near them are not the same thing. I miss him the way you miss a country you left behind. It's shaped me, but I am not required to return to it." Mother Catherine rose to clear dishes, and several of the women moved to help. Lyra found herself in the kitchen with Amara, working side by side, the older woman's hands moving with the efficiency of someone who had learned to be useful. "You will need to leave soon," Amara said, not unkindly. "Staying past the necessary time only makes it harder. You will begin to notice small things about him, the way he reaches for his spoon, the curve of his sleep. You will begin to feel as though you are abandoning him twice." "I am abandoning him," Lyra said. "No," Amara said. "You are giving him a life he could not have if you stayed. The Abbey will love him practically. You love him with all the weight of what he represents. Those are 2 different things, and the first is what he needs." That night, Lyra did not sleep. She lay in her narrow bed in the Abbey's guest room and listened to the sound of the wind against the stone, the distant bells marking the hours for prayer. In the morning, she would see the child one final time. She would hold him, memorize the precise weight of him, the way his small fingers would grasp at her dress. And then she would leave just as Amara had described before sentiment could convince her to stay. But in the dark, something shifted in her understanding. She had been thinking of her departure as an ending, a collapse of everything she had hoped to build. Amara's presence in the Abbey, the simple fact of her survival and transformation, suggested another possibility. That leaving was not failure, that sometimes the most radical act of love was to step away, to allow the child to be loved by those whose love was not complicated by their own need to be needed. As dawn began to lighten the window, Lyra made a decision. She would not run. Not the way Amara had run, not the way she had been running. She would move forward with intention. She would find work, build a small life in one of the villages near the Abbey, place herself close enough to know the child was alive and safe, distant enough to allow him to become someone who did not need her. It was not the life she had wanted, but it was the life she could choose. The village of Thornholt was small enough that Lyra's presence did not create ripples, large enough that she could find work without drawing attention. She took her position at the herbalist's shop, learning the names of plants and their uses, how to prepare tinctures and salves for the ailments that brought people through the door. The work was quiet and methodical, and it required enough of her attention that she could go entire hours without thinking about what she had left behind. The Abbey was visible from the highest point in the village, the pale stone visible on clear days like a reminder written in the landscape. She did not visit. She had promised herself she would not visit, knowing that one visit would lead to another, and another, until she had become the thing Amara had warned her against, a woman frozen at the gates of her child's life, unable to leave but unable to stay. Instead, she sent money, every month, whatever she could spare, along with brief letters requesting updates from Mother Catherine. The responses came regularly. The child was thriving, had learned to walk, was beginning to speak. The information was sparse and practical, exactly what Lyra had requested, and it was torture in its brevity. 6 months into her life in Thornholt, he came. She was in the herbalist's shop, measuring dried sage into packets, when she felt the shift in the air, that particular disturbance that accompanied the presence of something powerful trying to contain itself. She knew before she looked up. Some part of her had always known that Cale would eventually come to find her. He wore no insignia of rank, had dressed himself deliberately in the neutral clothing of a man of modest means, but the bearing could not be disguised. The way he moved through the space, the way his eyes found her across the dim interior of the shop, these things announced him regardless of what fabric covered him. I need a remedy for insomnia, he said to the herbalist, a woman named Petra who knew perfectly well who he was but had the good sense to pretend otherwise. Something that brings real sleep, not just absence of waking. Valerian root, Petra said, not glancing at Lyra, or chamomile. Depends on the nature of the wakefulness. Some people cannot sleep because their bodies will not rest. Others cannot sleep because their minds will not cease their work. The second, Cale said, it is the second kind. Petra began preparing a packet, moving with deliberate slowness, giving Lyra time to compose herself or flee. Lyra did neither. She remained where she was, her hands still among the dried herbs, her body suspended in a state of absolute tension. There is a tavern near the northern road, Cale said quietly to Lyra, his words ostensibly directed at Petra, but unmistakably meant for one person only. I will be there until sunset. If you do not come, I will leave and never return. You have my word. Petra handed him the packet of herbs, accepted his payment, and somehow managed not to acknowledge that one of the most powerful people in the Northern Territories had just issued an ultimatum dressed as an invitation. When he was gone, she turned to Lyra with the expression of someone who had learned long ago not to ask questions she did not want answers to. Go, Petra said. The shop will keep until tomorrow. Lyra did not go immediately. She finished her work, changed her dress, composed herself with the discipline of someone who had learnt to treat her own heart as an opponent that must be mastered. But her body was already moving toward the door before her mind had finished its objections. The tavern was the kind of place where people came to be forgotten. It sat on the edge of the village, and its patrons were transient merchants passing through, traveling craftspeople, people caught between destinations. Cale sat at a table in the corner, and he looked at her with the expression of someone who had rehearsed this moment so many times that actually living it felt like a recitation. I have seen him, he said before she could speak. 3 times. I did not make myself known. I simply watched him play in the Abbey garden. He is beautiful. He has your eyes. He is not your son, Lyra said, and the words came out sharper than she intended. You made that clear. You made it clear through action and decision. Do not claim him now out of— I am not claiming him, Cale interrupted quietly. I am acknowledging what I lost by trying to have everything. I came to tell you something, and then I will leave, as I promised. Lyra sat across from him, her body rigid with the effort of maintaining composure. Close to him, she could see what the months had done. There were lines around his eyes that had not been there before. His hands, which she remembered as always certain, now showed a faint tremor that he seemed to be fighting to suppress. The consort is pregnant, Cale said, legitimately. The pack believes it is mine. The succession is assured. My position has never been more secure. Then you have what you wanted, Lyra said. I have exactly what I wanted, Cale said. And it is unbearable. The silence stretched between them like an ocean. Around them the tavern continued its quiet business. The clink of cups, the murmur of conversations, the ordinary life of people unconcerned with the weight of impossible choices. I could not keep you and keep my throne, Cale continued. That was the truth I was avoiding. Not that you were unsuitable, not that the child was a threat, but that having you meant transforming into someone who could not hold this position. You made me want things I cannot have and remain who I am. Then we are both where we need to be, Lyra said, but the words tasted like ash. Are you? Cale asked. He leaned forward slightly. Are you truly at peace, Lyra? Because I am not. I wake at night and I think about the way his hand felt in mine. I think about the fact that I may never touch him again without it being a betrayal of everything I have built. I think about you, living in a village I cannot visit, raising yourself to a life half-lived because of my cowardice. I'm not raising myself, Lyra said. I am building a life. It is quiet, but it is mine. And that is more than I had before. A life I destroyed, Cale said. That is the part that wakes me at night. Not love, not longing, but the specific and particular knowledge that I made a choice that unmade everything good about you. Lyra's hands clenched on the table. She wanted to hurt him, wanted to make him feel the fracture that lived in her chest every moment of every day. But she also wanted to reach across the space between them and touch his face, confirm that he was real and suffering and present in her life in this moment that should not be happening. Why did you come here? she asked. Why now? What has changed? Nothing has changed, Cale said. And everything. I realize that I have been living in the shadow of a decision I made to protect my position, but the position no longer needs protecting. I have the consort. I have the child on the way. I have the pack's complete loyalty. I have everything I said I needed to have. And I have come to understand that none of it matters if you are not here. You cannot ask me to come back, Lyra said. The words were barely audible. I am not asking you to come back, Cale said. I am telling you that I am breaking the arrangement with the consort. I am telling the pack that I made an error in judgment, that I am stepping aside as alpha, that my brother will take my place. I am telling you that if you will have me, I am choosing you, and I am doing it knowing exactly what it will cost me. Lyra's breath caught. For a moment, she could not process what he was saying. The words seemed to exist in a language she no longer spoke. You cannot do that, she said. The pack will not accept it. The throne will destabilize. You will have destroyed your legacy for love, Cale finished. I am destroying my legacy for love, which is precisely what I should have been willing to do from the beginning. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a small object wrapped in cloth. The same object Soren had tried to give her at the Abbey gates. Lyra recognized it before she unwrapped it. A ring, ancient silver with a stone the color of her eyes. My grandmother wore this, Cale said. My mother wore it. It marks the only oath that matters. Not the crown, not the pack, not the throne. The choice to stand beside another person and mean it. Lyra stared at the ring at Cale, at the table between them that might as well have been the distance between worlds. Everything in her wanted to say yes, to reach across that table and claim what she had believed lost forever. But she also understood the cost, not to her, but to him, to the people whose lives depended on his stability, to the child in the Abbey who would know that he was the reason his father had sacrificed everything. If you do this, Lyra said slowly, you will resent me. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not for years, but eventually you will understand the weight of what you gave up. And that resentment will poison everything we build. I have already given it up, Cale said. The moment I ordered him taken away, I lost the right to be alpha, because an alpha who loves someone more than his own power is a contradiction. So I am simply acknowledging what was already true. He stood, leaving the ring on the table between them like an offering left before an altar. I'm staying at the inn on the Eastern Road for 1 week, he said. If you decide you believe me, that is where you will find me. If you decide you do not, I will understand. I will leave, I will begin my new life as a man without position, and I will spend whatever years remain to me trying to be worthy of having known you. He walked out of the tavern and Lyra sat alone with the ring, the weight of it somehow heavier than it should have been. The choice it represented far too large to fit into a single moment. Lyra did not go to him on the first day. She returned to the herbalist's shop and moved through her work like a woman sleepwalking, her hands measuring and mixing while her mind remained at that table in the tavern, staring at a ring that had been offered and refused. Petra did not ask questions, but she watched with the patient understanding of someone who had learned that women rarely needed advice. They needed time and quiet and the space to arrive at their own conclusions. On the second day, Lyra walked to the highest point in Thornholt and looked toward the Abbey. It was too far to see clearly, but she knew it was there. Knew that the child was waking and sleeping and becoming day by day more fully a person separate from her. Amara had said that missing someone and needing to be near them were different things. Lyra understood now that was a lie, or at least a partial truth. Missing someone meant a constant weight, a gravity that pulled you toward them regardless of what wisdom suggested. On the third day, she found herself on the Eastern Road without having consciously decided to travel it. Her feet carried her toward the inn as if she were a body animated by someone else's will. The innkeeper knew why she was there, everyone in the village knew why she was there, and he directed her without comment to a room on the upper floor. She almost turned back. Her hand was actually on the banister, her body prepared for retreat, when she heard his voice. I was beginning to believe you would not come, Cale said, and she turned to find him on the landing above her, his figure backlit by the window so that for a moment he was just a silhouette, a shape that could have been anyone. Then he moved into the light, and it was unmistakably him, the man she had loved and lost, standing as though he belonged to this moment, to this place, to her. I should not be here, Lyra said. No, Cale agreed, but you are. The room was small and cold, warmed only by a fire that had burned down to embers. Cale moved to tend it while Lyra stood near the door, as though proximity to the exit might grant her an escape route. But even as she thought it, she knew she was not going anywhere. I have dissolved my marriage to the consort, Cale said, his back to her, his attention on the fire. It took 2 days of negotiation and promises of settlement. She is not pleased, but she is practical. She will find another alpha in another territory, one who can give her legitimate children and an uncomplicated throne. The pack, Lyra began, has accepted my brother's ascension, Cale finished. Soren is stronger than I ever was. He will be a better alpha. The pack will prosper under his rule, which is more than I can say for my own. He turned to face her, and she saw the cost written across his features. He looked diminished somehow, not in strength but in the specific authority that had always surrounded him like a second skin. That power had been shed like a cloak, and what remained was simply a man smaller, more vulnerable, more human. There is nothing holding you here anymore, Lyra said. You could have simply left the village. I could have, Cale said, but I wanted you to see that I meant what I said. I wanted to stand before you without the armor of position, without the authority that allowed me to make choices for you. I wanted you to see the man underneath. He moved toward her, and she did not retreat. When he reached her, he took her hand, not with the certainty of a man accustomed to taking what he wanted, but with the tentative touch of someone asking permission for each millimeter of contact. I do not deserve forgiveness, he said, but I am asking for it anyway. Lyra's breath was shallow. She could feel her own heartbeat, the electricity of his proximity, the terrible magnetic pull of him. If I forgive you, if I say yes to whatever you are offering, what happens to him? What happens to the child? That is your choice, Cale said. We can tell him the truth when he is old enough to understand it, or we can let him remain as he is, a boy raised by the sisters, loved by them, free from the weight of knowing he was the reason his father abandoned a throne. Or something between those two possibilities. But it will be your choice. Lyra, I will not make another decision for you. Something in her chest cracked open at those words. Not suddenly, not violently, but like ice breaking at the first warmth of spring. She reached up and touched his face, and he held still, as though any sudden movement might shatter the fragile thing that was forming between them. They moved together without clear transition, without the moment of decision that usually preceded such things. His hands found the laces of her dress. Her fingers pulled at the fabric of his shirt. They became a tangle of limbs and breath and years of longing finally given physical form. It was not gentle. It could not be gentle when it was carrying the weight of so much loss and recovery. It was fierce and desperate and essential, as though they were trying to undo the months of separation through proximity alone. Afterward, they lay in the narrow bed while snow began to fall heavily outside the window, and she felt for the first time in months like she could actually breathe. His heartbeat was steady beneath her ear, his arms around her solid and real. I love you, he said into her hair. I have loved you since the day you refused to let me take the child. I have loved you through every moment of my cowardice since then. I love you too, Lyra whispered, and the admission felt like a betrayal of every principle she had built these months of distance on. But it was also true. It had always been true. They slept entangled, and for a few hours the world contracted to just the two of them, their bodies warm against each other in the cold room. Then the knock came. It came in the deep night, the kind of knocking that belongs to crisis or emergency. Cale woke first, moving from the bed with the ingrained reflex of a man accustomed to answering urgent calls. Lyra heard voices in the corridor, urgent, Soren's voice among them. Cale returned to the room, and she could see something had shifted in his face. A darkening, a return of that weight he had temporarily shed. What is it? She asked, though part of her already knew. Something had come to reclaim what they had just begun to build. The consort has taken ill, Cale said. Severely. She is dying and she is asking for me. Soren says the healers cannot determine the cause. It is spreading through the tower, claiming others now. They believe it is poison, and they believe I may be responsible. Are you? Lyra asked the question as simply as she could manage. No, Cale said. But that will not matter. Because if I do not return, if I do not attempt to save her life, or at least appear to grieve her death, the pack will have confirmation of their suspicions. Soren is trying to hold the throne steady, but without me demonstrating some loyalty to the woman I abandoned, the entire political structure could collapse. Lyra sat up, drawing the blanket around herself. Then you must go. If I leave now, Chaol said, I may not be able to return. If the consort dies, there will be investigations, accusations, demands for my presence. I will be trapped in the tower regardless of what I want. Then we choose, Lyra said. Again, we choose the same way we have been choosing. We choose what must be done over what we desire. I am tired of choosing that way, Chaol said, and there was something breaking in his voice that matched the breaking in her chest. I am tired of sacrificing what matters for what I am obligated to do. I know, Lyra said. So am I. But he is still there, in the tower. The consort is still there. The pack is still there. And they are all innocent of whatever choice we make. He was already moving, pulling on his clothes, understanding without being told that time had become a finite thing. Lyra dressed as well, her hands shaking as she fastened her laces. How long? She asked. I do not know, Chaol said. But if the poisoning is intentional, if someone is working to destabilize the throne, then my absence makes things worse, not better. Then go, Lyra said. Save what can be saved, and I will wait. I do not know if I will be able to come back to you, he said. I know, Lyra said. I have always known that. He kissed her once more, a farewell that tasted like grief and desperate tenderness. Then he was gone, and she was alone in the small room, listening to the sound of horses being prepared below, the urgency of crisis reshaping itself into action. Outside, the snow continued to fall, erasing the world in white, and Lyra understood with perfect clarity that she had just lived through the most beautiful and the most destructive moment of her life, and that everything that followed would be consequence. She did not know it yet, but Soren had brought more than an urgent message. He had brought the revelation of what had actually happened in the tower, what had actually caused the consort's illness, and what price was being demanded for the poisonous silence. Lyra would learn of it soon enough. But for now she sat in the winter darkness and waited for whatever crisis would come next, understanding that, in choosing love, she had also chosen the particular suffering that love demanded. Block 6. 7 years later, 800 words. Underscored, the garden grew wild in ways that Lyra had stopped trying to control. Wildflowers overtook the herb beds, and she had learnt to let them, discovering that some plants thrived better without imposed order. The cottage sat on the edge of Thornholt, close enough to the village for supplies, but distant enough to maintain the privacy that had become essential to their peace. Smoke rose from the chimney in thin, steady streams. Inside, the boy was learning his letters. He was nearly 8 now, tall for his age, with dark hair that caught the light like polished obsidian. His eyes were Chaol's, that distinctive amber that seemed to hold something deeper than mere color. Lyra watched him from across the small table as his tongue pressed between his teeth in concentration, forming the shapes of words with careful deliberation. Is this right? He asked, and his voice still carried the softness of childhood, though it was beginning to deepen into something more complex. Nearly, Lyra said. The R needs to curve differently, like this. She guided his hand, showing him the motion, and he corrected it with the quick learning of a child who had been given the gift of genuine instruction rather than rote memorization. His name was Emir now, though he had begun life as something else entirely. The abbey had called him by his given name for the first 4 years of his life, until the day Chaol had come with legal documentation and the weight of Soren's authority behind him. The reunion had been quiet, careful, a man introducing himself to a small boy with the tentative gentleness of someone who understood he was meeting a stranger, who simply happened to share his blood. The poisoning of the consort had never been officially solved. The healers had called it an unknown illness, a tragedy, a misfortune of the elements. But Lyra had pieced together the truth from fragments and silences. Someone in the tower had acted to remove an obstacle, and someone else had protected that someone else. And Chaol had been forced into the position of appearing to grieve a woman he had ceased to want, while simultaneously proving he had not orchestrated her death. It had taken 2 years for the suspicion to fade, for his sacrifice to be recognized as genuine loss rather than strategic positioning. By the time he had come to Thornholt permanently, the tower had receded into memory for Lyra. She had built a life here, a real one. Not a provisional shelter, but an actual existence with roots and rhythm and purpose. When Cale had arrived at her door, thin and worn and finally, truly free, she had seen the man beneath the alpha at last. A man who had learned to live without dominion, who had learned to find peace in absence of authority. They had married quietly, in the presence of Mother Catherine and Soren, without ceremony or announcement. The pack had accepted this with the pragmatic understanding that exiled alphas did not warrant political attention. Cale had found work with the leatherworkers, and his hands had learned trades that required skill rather than command. Lyra had continued her work with herbs, expanding it into a proper healing practice that drew people from 3 villages over. And then, 3 years ago, Soren had brought the boy to them. The sisters had agreed, with Mother Catherine's careful blessing, that the child would benefit from knowing his father directly. There were arrangements made, stories constructed for the villager-distant relation. An orphaned cousin, nothing that required deep investigation. Amir had come to them with a small trunk of possessions and a careful uncertainty about how to move through a home where 2 people seemed to operate as a unified force of attention. Now he was theirs in a way that transcended law or obligation. He was theirs through daily proximity, through the countless small moments that constructed love, the breakfast shared, the lessons given, the bandages applied to scraped knees, the stories told at bedtime about wolves and stars and kingdoms far away. "May I go outside?" Amir asked, setting down his quill. "Yes," Lyra said. "But stay where I can see you." She watched him through the window as he ran toward the garden, his thin legs carrying him with the unself-conscious joy of a child who had learned that the world was fundamentally safe. She heard Cale's footsteps on the stairs he had been reading in the bedroom, a habit he had developed in these years of peace, and he came to stand beside her. "He is growing," Cale said, and there was something in his voice that suggested he was still marveling at this fact, still unable to quite believe that this child was real and present, and his. "He looks like you," Lyra said. "Every day a little more." Cale reached into his pocket and withdrew something small and wrapped in cloth. For a moment Lyra thought it was the ring, the one she had worn now for 7 years. The one that had started everything and nearly destroyed everything before finally securing what mattered. But when he opened his hand, it was something different. A small wooden horse, intricately carved, worn smooth by the passage of time. "Soren brought this," Cale said. "He says it was mine, as a child, before the throne, before any of it. He thought Amir should have it." Lyra took the carved horse and turned it over in her hands. It was beautiful in its simplicity, a thing that spoke of a person Cale had been before ambition had claimed him. She set it on the windowsill where Amir could see it when he returned. Outside, the boy was running through the garden, his laughter carrying on the autumn wind. The moon was beginning to rise over the distant hills, pale and patient, and in her chest. Lyra felt the particular peace that came only from having survived what should have destroyed her. The cost had been paid. The consequence had been borne. And what remained was this: a cottage, a garden, a man who had learnt to love without possession, and a child who would grow up knowing that sometimes the greatest strength was in the willingness to let go. She leaned her head against Cale's shoulder, and they stood together in silence, watching their son play in the gathering dusk.